Hello! Today we're doing something a bit different. We're reviewing It's Good to Be a Man by Michael Foster and Dominic Tennant. I've never read a gender theory book of any kind. It's stuff I normally stay 50 feet away from at all times, whether decidedly feminist or not, right-leaning, left-leaning, academic, whatever. Just, yuck. It's not abstract enough for me. It's too emotive and often looks vacuous. Gross. But on my Twitter feed at release of this book, I kept seeing it being branded as a misogynist work, evil, but also the pinnacle of pro-man thinking by the men going their own way kind of crowd. So of course, I had to pick it up. Read books you think you'll hate. It's very rewarding. So I'm going to go chapter by chapter, summarising ideas and commenting at the same time. So let's go. Chapter 1. Patriarchy. Patriarchy in this chapter is described as the state of men ruling, and it's not an inherent negative, but an inevitability, a natural order that rears its head whether we accept it or not. It is not the case that all patriarchy is good because it is natural, however. It is the case that there is a war on good patriarchy by bad patriarchy. Patriarchal societies throughout time have existed because patriarchy is what we naturally do, not out of habit, but because this is how we inherently are, and there's no getting away from it. The chapter goes on to list 3 ways of war on good patriarchy waged by bad patriarchs. Way 1 is to recruit the male citizenry to your evil cause. The second way is to subdue the male citizenry, and failing all else, if they keep rising up despite you quashing them, the third way is to destroy them with wrath. Fruitless pursuits are used for the second way for subjugation, like pornography, pop media, gaming, etc. Generations of subjugation, that second way of waging war on good patriarchy, has led to millions of men groping for father figures. Their fathers were inadequate, even if present, because of this war on good patriarchy, and the power vacuum is being filled by modern-day Absaloms. And that passage about Absalom at the gates of the city is analogous to the alpha male charlatans of the day, struck me as just a very good way of describing this phenomenon. Chapter 2. Masculinity is very good. Reading this chapter, I was automatically a little bit put off by the interpretation of Genesis, and it also throws away the idea of love as a reason for mankind's creation, and I would contest that. I did have a moment of fear at this point that Foster and Tennant were about to assert the English translation of mankind in early Genesis literally means the male of the human species, which it really started to sound that way, but thankfully not. Love as a reason for creation doesn't detract from the points they go on to make in this chapter. God can have created humanity as an outward act of love, and creation itself can be a form of waning pantheism of divine veiling out of this love, and the ideas expressed about Adam as father, as ruler, as masculinity's first expression can still stand. Just a side note, but important to bear in mind. It also makes a strong case for the unwitting hole left by replacing dominion and rule themes from the Bible, especially in Genesis and in general the Old Testament, with soft euphemisms like stewardship. These things aren't necessarily done out of malice, but they do leave a semantic vacuum, making it easier to gel together Christianity and this idea of being soft and weak and passive with regards to the world around us. This is especially a problem with regards to building a biblical idea of masculinity. There's also the idea communicated in this chapter that males have urges to dominate, to shape, to build where nothing was before, and that this is a good thing. I did have a thought whilst reading this. As a woman, we have a natural urge to maintain, to build on the existing. This isn't inferior, as so many of us fear, but necessary. What good is infrastructure, literal or social, if you build it and leave it to rot? That's not to say there's no overlap between the constructive activities that men and women are drawn to or do, but it is arguably a general pattern. I'd agree with the book to that extent. Connotations of words like rule and dominion to the modern ear conjure images of violence, but this isn't necessarily true. Ruling and exercising dominion do not necessitate being forceful, wrathful, and destructive as a result. I agree with Foster and Tennant in that you can be a firm leader without being vicious and quashing any errant plants in the Garden of Eden, so to speak. On that note, the Garden of Eden is also talked about in a meaningful way here. Thinking about creation even post-fall as a garden helps us to see that dominion is not malice. To care for the garden is not just cutting down the errant plants, nor just destroying weeds, but also shaping creation to grow in a way that is beneficial to itself and to Adam/mankind in general, and keeping it in some sort of order. Chapter 3. sex is very good. Sex is described in this chapter as the engine of dominion. The book brushes off the bonding aspect as less important than the bigger picture of creating the new generation. But the bond of coupling and marriage in general is the foundation on which households are built, so I'm not on board with dismissing the bond as unimportant in its own right, though the authors believe it important in the broader scheme of things, and I appreciate this chapter is about the act of sex. Building a household is necessary as it is a building block for a community, which is a building block for whole cultures, etc, etc. I agree with that. Some souls are not called to build households, but for 99.9% of us, a household of some kind is part of a good path for us. It's biblically justifiable, even lauded, as a path for some to remain single, to not create progeny. But as this book is for most young men, of course, it's unlikely to apply. Beware, though, the sweeping statement. Just as patriarchy can be twisted to evil purposes but is ultimately a natural order, the same can of course be said of sex. The chapter goes on to say that ultimately the male sex drive is what drives cultures and communities. It is because of it that people reproduce as much as they do, which is right, I guess. The way it's written makes it sound like sex drive is loftier and more profound than it is, but I appreciate that they aren't wrong to say that sex causes births, which causes communities, and so on. And men generally have higher sex drives. It was just described dramatically enough in the book that it became a little amusing. In that vein, my initial reaction is that this chapter gives the impression of talking over women's heads, i.e. sex is something you do to a woman to reproduce. Man's sex drive rules and dominates the creation of communities. However, to be generous, I realise that this is a product of the book's purpose. As I said earlier, I've never read a book all about gender roles, so all literature of every kind that I have ever read has never tried so hard as this book to separate the masculine and feminine underpinnings of the world, which is a very unnatural thing to do even in small pieces of prose. Of course, a very short handbook on godly masculinity is going to sound like this. You can talk about the masculine without talking about the feminine. It's to the point, I get that. It's not a complaint, just a knee-jerk reaction worth mentioning. It also made a good point that the recent culture of extreme sexual openness actually has its perks, in that we, including the church, are less inclined to hold bizarrely naive views around it today. For example, in the book, they describe the view of some church fathers asserting that sex, even within marriage, is sinful. Chapter 4. The War on Sex. Again, this chapter is reiterating the idea that sex is good when used in accordance with its telos, its purpose. My favourite quote: "Satan loves sex like tin pot dictators love foreign aid." This is just brilliant. Everything in creation is separated and divided because it has its own individual role, its own telos to fulfill. God created the world like this. The diversity we see in creation in all forms has a purpose, and isn't just divided for the sake of it. The same can be said, of course, of sex, the male and the female. The rejection of gender roles does not necessarily come from an evil place amongst activists. It comes from the collective recognition of cultural strife relating to gender, but wrongly pins the issues on one sex or the other. Men aren't feminine enough, women aren't masculine enough, or women's femininity doesn't do what I want it to, so it's all women's fault. The correct cause of this cultural strife around gender is identified in the chapter as its erosion. Complementary roles are needed in God's creation. It also talks about hierarchy. Man submits to God, woman submits to man. The chapter also talks about women being inferior to men as the weaker vessel, physically and spiritually. I took issue with this use of inferiority and weakness together, and I'll tell you why. Normally, when we use inferior, we mean lower in quality, but it can of course simply mean below, as in lower in the hierarchy, which is a different concept. But put together with weakness, the implication is clear in the book that this is meant as lower quality. I agree with the rejection of two equal halves, as men and women together form a whole, but to view the woman as inferior undoes the message of the book up to this point, which is complementarianism. It is to suggest man as 3/4 of the pie chart of a successful household, and the remaining 1/4 of the pie chart as woman's contribution. A clear imbalance. One is clearly better than the other, because, as the book has said up until this point strangely, men and women are different. They are contributing different things to their households and communities, not differing amounts of the same thing. This stands in opposition to the biblical man is head, woman is feet in a household also. A man bristling whilst listening to a woman saying, "No, I'm not inferior," is a perfect example of why creation needs that complementary relationship between man and woman, as per this book. Many weak men fall prey to the war on sex that this chapter is about, and become prideful in their role as leader of the household, even get attached to stereotypes from man-made media, detached from the Bible and the goodness of God's creation. We are meant to lead each other to Christ. The current gender politics issues are not your fault as a man, nor are they my fault as a woman, but it is our duty as men and women to try to rectify this and create healthy, whole communities with our respective differences as well as similarities, even in small ways. Another point the chapter makes is to denigrate individualism, and I would disagree to a point. We all have individual relationships with God, and so are necessarily also individuals as well as parts of a collective. And the collective part is, of course, played down quite a lot in common discourse, and we're all following our own telos for the bigger picture of God's creation. This necessary individualism is why I also object to the hierarchy of God, man, and woman. We are all subject to God primarily, see Ephesians 5:21-33, and then by extension to our roles in His creation. There is only one superior party in terms of authority and quality in this discussion, and it is God. A wife can be a good, godly influence on her husband without violating this order at all. Something else worth bearing in mind is that we as humans do not all have to reproduce. Be fruitful as a directive to the species, as the authors correctly identify. But as we have seen in, again, John the Baptist, Elijah, Paul himself, being a parent is not mandatory for every individual to lead a godly life. Of course, there is such a thing as foregoing parenthood for the wrong reasons, analogous to the twisting of nature like patriarchy and sex to evil purposes. This is applicable to the vast majority. You cannot, of course, structure a society based upon the exceptions, but you do structure a society based upon the general rules, with enough flexibility and maturity to appropriately handle exceptions, including open and mature discussions, as an example, about female fertility in particular, and how short a period of a woman's life it is. Chapter 5. Spiritual War and Spiritual Worship. This chapter is all about idolatry, essentially, and it starts with some theory from a marriage counsellor who observes that men who are feminized in accordance with what secular feminists in the recent past said would fix men hasn't improved divorce rates at all. In fact, it's led to more woman-instigated divorces unrelated to abuse from what Randy Gunther can tell in this passage. There's an interesting observation here, that women will gravitate towards more masculine men, drawing upon the observations about this made by psychologist Randy Gunther, and the chapter importantly notes that Gunther is very loath to acknowledge the exact conclusion that she has laid out so plainly. I think this was a good example to choose. It encapsulates the cognitive dissonance in many who notice this, the shyness with which we approach the fact that men and women are different and relate to the world in different ways, for fear of coming across as rejecting the idea of individual personalities, which of course still exists in the face of general patterns. The book extends this androgynous divorcees problem to a wider issue of this androgyny, embodied through sex, orientation, and social behaviour, and says that this is inherently pagan. I wasn't sure about this choice of word until I considered that pagan is an umbrella term. I wouldn't have used the term pagan myself, as it invokes some conscious organisation though, some conscious religious practice. I do strongly agree on the idea that nobody is irreligious. Here I would have harked back to chapter 1, which the authors don't do. In the same way that those without a father on earth seek one way or another, those without a spiritual father seek one also. And in both cases, they latch on to whatever is available. Everyone is religious, whether they admit it or not, whether they like the term religious or not. We all worship something in different ways, and the idea communicated in this chapter is that to worship the man-made, the Baals and golden calves of this world is to, again, take that inbuilt nature of man to worship and to use it incorrectly. You shall have no gods before me isn't arbitrary after all. Again, the book draws on Genesis in a way that is very meaningful here. It all comes back to honouring creation. I'm also a big supporter of drawing a clear distinction between religious practice and faith, two very different things. The book draws upon quite a few verses supporting this idea. Chapter 6. toxic sexuality. Reiterated in this chapter is the important idea that mankind will always seek to raise up a name, glorify someone, and if not God, it will be somebody else, and to not glorify God is to glorify Satan. It moves on to sexuality with this, and I do agree with the idea that swinging from man to man, as in Sheryl Sandberg's book, is a detriment to all parties, and truly terrible advice. Likewise, picking a man to marry on basis of, or even slightly considering, how passive and submissive he will be when it comes to your behaviour, which of course includes the sinful, is incredibly detrimental. That's a bad foundation for a household. Bizarrely though, right after drawing upon this example, the chapter starts to fall into this trap as well. It starts off promisingly with the dreaded biblical passage from Paul on modesty and submission of women in the church, rightly identifying the unneeded apologies made for it. But then it starts to talk about the natural order of the household and advise men with very Sandberg-esque advice that they must find a woman who is passive and submissive when it comes to their behaviour, which again includes the sinful. But pushback comes in multiple forms. A woman trying to lead like a man, trying to be a man in that sense, is one thing. But a woman leading like a woman does as a man's wife is something else. Ephesians 5:22-30 is an explicit description of the reciprocal nature of marriage. Reciprocal, but not identical from both perspectives, as men and women are different by design, of course. Contrasting Proverbs 21:19 and Proverbs 22:24-25 is also particularly striking. I just love the way the former is phrased. Even the Hebrew word for helper in Genesis, rightly brought up time and time again in this book, has the same stem as the word used for God helping man, heightening this sense of reciprocity. Man and woman influence one another, and that's the way it should be. Both belong to God. Both must learn and love Scripture, correcting and caring for one another. Someone not ready for that, male or female, is not ready to be married. The description of a loud woman towards the end of the chapter starts off familiar to most, but then it falls off a bit in a similar kind of way, and it becomes a bit of a mix of traits that belong to godly women as well as the worst of sinners amongst women. Sexual immodesty in a holy building is brought up right next to the general concept of having a voice in church, which is a very broad idea that includes the formation of extra service groups by women like women's Bible studies or any events at all, or raising the alarm when needed on untoward behaviour. Any number of actions comes under having a voice. While I think I somewhat know what the author means, it was not clear, and I would like to have seen a more detailed explanation of this. Rather strangely as well, on page 81, Matthew Henry's An Exposition of the Old Testament is brought up as an example of a loud woman. I'll read this out now. By her place, not her own house. She hates the confinement and employment of that. Her feet abide not there any longer than needs must. She is all for gadding abroad, changing place and company. Now is she without in the country, under pretence of taking the air, now in the streets of the city, under pretence of seeing how the market goes. She is here and there and everywhere, but where she should be. She lies in wait at every corner, to pick up such as she can make a prey of. Virtue is a penance to those to whom home is a prison. The reason I say strangely is because although, yes, a wife hating her household and doing anything to be away is the point here and is not a good thing, but the examples of excuses for being physically outside of the house are not just incredibly benign, but I cannot see an alternative to this that doesn't involve staying inside and thinking of nothing else but building the household. Not only is that not healthy as an expectation for yourself or for others, that's not sane. A happy homemaker, of course, has a major goal in the successful development of their household, but having other interests and other goals is not only no detriment, it's necessary. Again, this is an essential part of nature, the intellect of man, which can be used to glorify God, or to glorify something else. I agree that it's no punishment to build a home with someone you love. It isn't being chained down. A fond memory of mine in this vein is my father expressing this to me. Being the way I am, I always felt compelled, growing up, to apologise to my father for the many sacrifices he made for me, of all kinds and magnitudes. He liked to quote Elton John to me in response, "It's no sacrifice." Chapter 7. The Church Effeminate. I agree with the reiterated idea that natures can be twisted to sin, but this chapter gave me the sense of a distinct culture gap, which I didn't expect. Giving the benefit of the doubt and assuming the church that the authors described does exist, Nothing they list exists in my part of the world. The whisper nets, the biddies, the condemnation of men's sins only. I mean, at the time of writing, the last sermon I heard was my pastor saying that if we are not challenged in our faith, if we do not face conflict in it, then our faith is in trouble. Does that not play into the masculinity of this book? Again, the lay-down Christianity or lay-down masculinity false dichotomy that Foster and Tennant rightly put down is a symptom of this too. It sounds to me that the authors are familiar with non-traditional American churches, fringe denominations maybe. Where I come from, there are different roles that play to masculinity as well as femininity in and around the church, for the ordained and the lay person. On a side note, I did like the brief point of ordained-only duties being performed in churches increasingly by lay people. This is something I've seen from time to time, and it rubs me the wrong way. I'm still thinking on how to deal with that in discourse, and now that it's been brought to my mind again, I've got a discussion with my pastor to educate myself. Once again in this chapter, we do find the sweeping generalization of women as all passive and unable to engage in critical thinking, both for the pious woman and the loud woman as described in this book. If it were described as a tendency of most in most contexts, that would still run the risk of being fallacious, but it misses slightly and pins this as an inherent trait of all women. It falls again into the trap of the men going their own way crowd / the pathologizing everything crowd, gotta love that horseshoe, going beyond working from stereotypes to using them as a hard and fast rule. An essential factor in the discussion, no room for a mature conversation at all. This gets in the way of finding good places for men and women in the church, and the fact that there is of course going to be overlap without detracting from masculinity and femininity. Just that the two sexes will approach the selection of roles that can be unisex differently. I did dismiss my similar criticism in the last chapter because the book is about one side, but they did have a whole book, and this same sweeping generalization to the detriment of the discussion keeps coming up. There was an interesting idea here on the inextricability of the soul and the body, despite our language on this topic. I hadn't thought about how much I still have a very naturalistic way of talking about the body and soul, the meatbag view, as described by Foster and Tennant. This has wider implications regarding how we discuss sins, as this chapter says. Sins of the flesh are not just against God and the body, but against the soul, and so on and so forth. The wider issue we're seeing here is how nebulous female and male roles are. This isn't a reason to dump the discussion as we have in recent decades, nor a reason to go with the hard and fast rules based on stereotypes, but all the more reason to write and read books like this. Chapter 8. No Father, No Manhood. I agree with the central idea that fathers are essential role models for masculinity, for eventually fatherhood, and for general life advice. And I'm astonished I hadn't been anticipating this chapter. The Bible is full of God as father to his children, and it is rife with tales of how he disciplines, cares for, and just generally raises his earthly sons. There's a fantastically put idea here that God as father is not anthropomorphizing. It is theomorphic, as Foster and Tennant call it, because God is the archetype of the father upon which earthly fathers are based. It is the earthly father that is theomorphic. God made each and every eventual earthly father in his own image, not just in body, but he also programmed man for fatherhood and discipleship, if not literally siring children. Stats on fatherless homes, cited from John Sauer's Fatherless Generation, should come as no surprise. It is tragic we have enough data for this at all, but a blessing that we have stats like these to contribute to our understanding of just how vital the father is. There were some interesting comments from Robbie Lowe's article in Touchstone on mothers versus fathers' effect on the behaviour of children in a household throughout their lives, and how much greater the influence of fathers is. However, as much as I find that I would like to believe this is true, because it is a very interesting observation, and as much as I feel that it is intuitively plausible, I will need to read the article and do a little wider reading myself, so no further comment on that for now. It does also offer hope to the fatherless, as well as what the authors acknowledge must seem like a prophecy of doom to any fatherless men reading, to turn to the church and be discipled by a good pastor. If there are really, truly no good options in terms of churches and pastors, the suggestion is to find a solution, to be proactive, and not to sit and complain. That is a brilliant attitude to have. This was my favourite chapter so far. If Foster and Tennant wrote a whole book on fatherhood, I'd absolutely read that. Chapter 9. No Gravitas, No Manhood. Gravitas is contrasted in this chapter with kabod. Kabod is unearned, as in the gravity with which people born into status like royalty are treated. Gravitas, by contrast, is something earned. It is the impression a person makes on the community around them. The book explains that this is especially important for men, And I agree. If a man is to lead his children as a father, to lead a household, even just to be a positive masculine influence on his peers at any age, see Job 32 verses 8 through 9, he must have gravitas. And the root of this is in humility before God. Something not mentioned but brought to my mind is kabod being present for parents also. From the perspective of a young child, their father has kabod. They fear him, they respect him, but only because of what he is. And that wears off if the father has no gravitas. There's some especially striking phrasing in the book on the idea that a man must know fear in order to be feared, and so that fearing God, as we should, is necessary for developing respect and gravitas. Using the Lord's name in vain and unique descriptors like holy in vain is also brought up as a microcosm of undue flippancy, part of this developing an attitude of respect that is necessary for any man. It also brings up comedy as a means of us beginning to assuage our collective guilty consciences and sins by talking about them openly, and then making a joke out of it to take away the shame. I agree with this. I think this might also partly explain how pervasive social commentary is in comedy. Double so now that doing it explicitly is the trend of the day, for better or for worse. I really like that the book then goes on to explain how heavy a burden this is, using the example of the self-serious man. We all know one. If you're on the Christian corner of Bird app, you probably know 50. There is a difficult balance to strike between taking what should be taken seriously, and taking absolutely everything seriously, to your detriment. As in the book, I also agree that the self-serious fail just as much as the constantly self-deprecating in terms of generating gravitas. They struggle to generate respect beyond the base level of respect you have for anyone. Treat lightheartedly what you can, and treat with solemnity what you must. If I may be sentimental, this is something my soon-to-be husband balances very well, to the point that you consciously notice. It's very admirable. The book also brings up, in the same vein, how treatment of elders is a good litmus test for how well a man fears God. It's also an interesting take on honour thy mother and thy father, that this refers to your seniors in general, as well as your actual earthly parents. I like that interpretation a lot. It fits well with recurrent biblical messages of revering those older and more experienced than you, and loving correction. And so, of course, I was glad to see the stream of consciousness about wisdom that is Proverbs being brought up in this context. I've been enjoying thinking on that. Chapter 10. Gravitas through duty. This chapter has some really excellent advice in it about productivity, more importantly, wise productivity. The phrasing could use a bit of work in a particular passage on workmanship sort of midway through the chapter. Its meaning comes out a bit inconsistent. It changes too much as you read it, rather than expanding on the same consistent message as you read it. Workmanship is about becoming useful. This is a uniquely masculine quality. It also talks about usefulness as a masculine quality exclusively. I wouldn't agree with this. This goes against taking the wisdom from experienced useful women that you need to, something mentioned only a few sentences earlier, like one's mother or female elders, as also mentioned in the last chapter. It then goes on to say that, primarily in dating, women see men as success objects, and men see women as sex objects, in line with base instincts that come from the order of God's creation. I can see this as a generalization of the dating world, a pessimistic one at that, but it does again slightly fall into the trap of the men going their own way movement the book denigrated earlier, which is largely based on men with bad romantic taste and a frustrating feeling of unfocused energy projecting their woes onto every woman. Though I prefer how the book expands on the usefulness factor, women look for active and potential utility. It's an interesting idea that this utility phenomenon is not integral to femininity, but is to masculinity. I actually agree. Women cannot get by being seen as high quality if they are useless. But we do not rely on our proficiency in any hard or soft skill for social status, not inherently. You can get by on your social skills with passable hard skills and be a high-quality woman in the eyes of your peers, family, colleagues, and potential mates. The physical strength disparity between the sexes is brought up a little more often in this chapter. This book isn't especially cerebral, which isn't a bad thing, by the way, but there's this one particularly vapid line and I've just got to read it out. A woman who is strong like this is butch and unnatural. A man who is not is gay. It kind of blindsides you as you're reading and it gave me a giggle. Discussions of strength in more detail in this chapter actually warmed me to general patriarchal ideology, ideas about sex differences, and taught me a little too. Even up to this point in the book, the message had been women weak and parasitic, man strong and take care of her. But this went into a bit more detail about what aspects of strength are inherently masculine, which is to say, not all of them. Strength penetrates and divides, overcomes and shapes, prevails and subdues. After all, if women are weak, how can they possibly make good mothers, good grandmothers, a good half of the species? A stable culture relies on the complementary merits of both sexes. As mentioned before, there will naturally be some overlap in the extolling of virtues like physical strength, but not always a total overlap. This is, of course, still a nebulous idea that Tennant and Foster are championing, but it has to be. It is nebulous in nature. Strength is not an achievement born of concrete steps. It is still worth discussing in the equally nebulous concept of masculinity. The chapter also encourages the reader to connect wisdom, workmanship, strength, all these virtues together. Wisdom without strength is as futile as strength without wisdom is destructive. Very good advice. The chapter also encourages self-betterment through 5 different things every man needs to stop doing: seeking praise, self-deprecating, complaining, making excuses, and breaking promises. I won't go through them all, but the first struck me as especially important, not just to a universal audience, because it definitely applies to everyone, but for a young male reader in particular. I can't speak from first-hand experience, of course, but seeking the approval of women and peers seems to be the false dichotomy many young men are forced into. If they can't attract women, they feel emasculated, so seek their approval. If they can't impress their peers, they feel emasculated, so seek their approval. This, in a nutshell, is why books like this are needed, to show young men that their validation as men comes from God, his telos for them, and how they, as servants of God, fulfill that telos, not the world's perception. A final thought on the very last page of this chapter: be worthy of God's name. I realise this is a statement meant to embolden, meant to play positively on the masculine drive, but it is worth noting that none of us are worthy, and we will never be worthy, and that's a core part of our faith as Christians. I'd rephrase this as strive to be worthy of God's name, and it still doesn't lose its impact phrased that way. Chapter 11. How to bear the weight. The sentiment expressed in this chapter is one of not following the red pill crowd, seeking the more experienced as role models rather than entrenching oneself in self-righteous ire, however genuinely righteous the roots of it may be, and I very strongly agree with that. Be aware by all means of what drives your personal anger and societal anger from those like you and those out of your circle. It's easy, however, without prioritizing Christ and his example, and without a father figure, to fall into an endless cycle of anger. The black pill is also rightly denigrated. What a miserable life to condemn oneself to. I once sympathised with this to the extent of the book, which is to recognise the ills in the world, but I've never understood pessimism in any context, really. I know suffering, but even in the worst moments, I've genuinely failed to understand how you can contemplate the fact that you exist, to look around at creation, whether religious or not, and believe that life is inherently negative. That's one of the most cheering things there is. You can feel unable to cope with pain, but to feel unable to love creation is another issue. It very much ties into the do not complain tenet of the previous chapter. I've met multiple defeatist men, and still I don't understand. Seeing others agree with me, I still find, however, that I attribute this to a lack of empathy on my part. Maybe that's a good thing. Toil is cited as a masculine joy primarily, which may be true. I feel like this is where I need input from men in particular, but this is not a single-sex issue in the slightest. I struggle with the same issues around needing to toil, needing to be busy that are cited in this chapter. I mean, look at me, it wasn't even enough for me to just read a book that I thought might be interesting. I felt so compelled to create something from the act of reading the book that I created a book review. I do not object to this being in a handbook about masculinity, of course, because it should be if it's a universal issue, and I strongly suspect that it goes beyond just being a unisex trait of every person in my family specifically. I'm by no means special. There will have been billions just like me, and there'll be more in generations to come. The chapter also talks about the joy to be found in work. There's great use of Pauline advice here about the joy found in dedicating whatever you do to the Lord. It's interesting to consider that even work done on others' terms can be done righteously, heartening but also emboldening. Chapter 12, Manhood through Mission. There's some truly excellent advice for general productivity here again, but more importantly, godly productivity. It uses this as the definition for a mission. I agree with this. It stresses as well, crucially, that despite modern connotations, a godly mission is not necessarily directly linked to the church. It may well turn out to be, but for most men it simply isn't. There are 3 assumptions the chapter lists that you should avoid. Mission must be spiritual, it must be legendary, and all plans for it must be precise, concrete, and followed to the letter. In addressing all of these, Foster and Tennant effectively argue against romanticising one's mission, but at the same time, they do not denigrate it or shrug the ordinary off as second best, but the best you can probably achieve. This is a very, very good message to put out there. My mind is drawn again to generations of disillusioned, unattached, angry young men who lack a purpose. Bearing this chapter's advice in mind can both ground and motivate such people en masse, and this very much needed to be said. Again, Foster and Tennant have done what they've set out to do with this book very well in this particular chapter, to add a voice to the thin mix of positive advice for young God-fearing men, but also for the non-religious men, drawing them into an improved way of life, one hopes. It is importantly stressed, again, that seeking approval through one's mission is an open invitation to all kinds of sinful habits to find their way into your life and to corrupt your mission. As I'm writing this, I'm reminded of a line from a sermon from my own regular church. God has given you a unique set of experiences, skills, and thoughts. There is nobody in human history who has ever had your opportunities. What are you going to do about that? Chapter 13. The Necessity of Fraternity. The best phrasing so far to describe the different social habits of men and women comes in this chapter, and I'm definitely going to hang on to it. It talks about men as socializing on the basis of exclusion, and women for inclusion. It's why men constantly test each other with these little jibes and bond by verbal or physical sparring when they're younger, whereas women bond by providing positive feedback, affirming each other as members of the group, not by pushing back on them. The comment of male and female friendships briefly mentioned is that male friendships are more long-lasting because they're built on stress, but I disagree here. Good quality female friendships also resist the stresses of time, conflict, individual strife, and so on. This is not to the exclusion of the femininity of the women. The caveat to add onto Foster and Tennant's assertion that male friendships are stronger is that the incidence of strong, long-lasting friendships between men seems to be higher than it is between women. That's just speaking anecdotally, of course. The potency of this effect is observable still, but of course weaker in a male-female friendship. There's an interesting parallel drawn to forms of government. Meritocracies and right-wing authoritarianism are put more into the masculine group of government because the focus is on self-betterment and testing whether or not you belong to the group. More left-leaning authoritarianism is talked about as effeminate because of the exact opposite. And if you don't belong to the group, woe betide you. Of all the comments made by the authors thus far, this lends the most strength to the recurrent arguments about the differences between the masculine and the feminine. This ties it together very well, in a sensible way. This does not reduce masculine to some rugged Chad meme stereotype. There is room for personhood in the way masculinity is described in this chapter. This is especially important as a chapter for the majority of people who will read this book. The politicos, the Twitter theologians, for whom the temptation to jump into bad brotherhoods and seek approval above working to glorify God is very great. Tennant and Foster probably fall into this category a little bit too. That's not an insult, it's probably just the circles they travel in. Again, the advice in this chapter is excellent. It particularly struck a chord with me, as I know it will with many of you, so read it. Chapter 14. The Excellence of Marriage. This chapter was a good note to end on, because as this chapter strongly reiterates, marriage should come after you've got your house in order. Hard agree on that there is nothing more tragic than a person who does not value themselves or God enough to put their own development, their own mission to glorify God above any singular other person. As the authors say, if marrying the one is your goal, where do you go from there once you've done it? Is that the end of your ambition and the end of your support of one another as a couple? The emphasis here is on how the authors feel a woman must look down upon a man who thinks like this, but this would go both ways. No man in his right mind likes being endlessly clung to and chased by a woman with no sense of self. I like the return to the helper idea in creation as analogous for the roles of man and wife. The English translation of the word helper is a bit lacking, but this chapter, and those before to differing extents, add on to it some more, defining it as she who does what I cannot as the husband. I like this way of thinking about it. It avoids ambiguity, but again leaves enough ambiguity for sensible discussion, for not falling into the same traps that chapter 5 surprisingly did, or that men going their own way, or other black-pilled men might do, or even toxic feminists. Neither husband nor wife is by themselves an incomplete person, but joined together as per God's design, they make a more complete package than either one of them could separately, no matter how pious, strong, or wise they each may be. They also reject the other half as a phrase, which I initially disagreed with. It is an incomplete phrase, and not a wrong one. Your spouse is the other half not of you, but of your household. Maybe complementary part is better than half here. Doesn't have the same ring, of course. The chapter does basically go on to say this. And to the idea of women wanting leaders, this is succinctly conveyed in men ask, what does she look like? And women ask, what does he do? Again, I would say this is a phenomenon found mostly in the dating world, and while it can possibly translate into other aspects of life as well, trying to stretch it too far is definitely a danger. It does have a very good message, this chapter. Marriage is neither the end goal, nor something to rush into. Many young Christian men are exposed to marriage bashing in popular media, and also to romanticizing marriage in their Christian circles. Neither approach is right. Proverbs 24 verse 27 is a fantastic summary of this. Set out on your mission, find stability, find fraternity, find father figures, and then worry about supporting others, in particular, supporting your wife. In conclusion, this book is, as it says in the afterwords, meant to be timely, but not timeless. It successfully does what it says on the tin. It lays out the issues young men face, and offers some general solutions, from the experience of two settled men who have had their share of spiritual battles, no doubt. Tennant was an atheist once. I wonder what that story is. I'm not this book's target audience, nor do I need to be. If you're a young man watching this, or even an older, settled man, I think this book raises questions about your sex and about just getting your life together, and tips for productivity that are important for you to consider. Besides, I have men in my life I care about deeply. I cannot be a good influence to them without considering the strengths, weaknesses, and present-day problems surrounding their sex. My own ideas of gender have developed that bit more because of this book. Some of that development lines up with the authors, and some doesn't. I have questions to ask, and some answers to give, prompted by this read, and that is what every good book does. So, would I recommend this book? Absolutely. Is it academically rigorous? No. But does it fulfill its aim? Yes. That's all for this review. Thank you so much if you stuck around to this point. Take care, and God bless. And buy a copy.